Hello, lovely people. Welcome to another book chat. The regular but not didn't do it right, did I? How many times have I said this? Like 50 something, and yet.
Sophie Vlogs.
I've got 6 books to talk about today. About half of those are non-fiction, so I'm going to start with fiction and poetry, and then we're going to end a little non-fiction run. So, first up, we've got Lie Sleeping by Ben Aaronovitch. I always stumble on his surname, and I don't know why. This is something ridiculous, like the 8th book of the Peter Grant Rivers of London series, something like that. I'm going to talk about it in a spoiler-free manner because we are partway through a series, but I thoroughly enjoyed this, as I thoroughly enjoy most of this series. Peter Grant is a police detective constable, I don't know the correct word, by this stage is working for essentially like the supernatural division. This book is sort of tying back into our overarching big bad plotline. We're trying to hunt down the big bad, stop some terrible things from happening. This one had a lot of themes in it, which are themes that I really enjoy. So I always enjoy these because they're usually quite funny, quite humorous. I like trying to piece together what our particular mystery is each time. This one was much more back on track with the main plot line. Some of the ones recently have been like, not in, sometimes they feel like they're focusing on something different, but I'm starting to see, like for example, Foxglove Summer. When I first read that one, I was like, we're taking a new track, which is fun, but we've left this main topic behind us. But actually, I'm starting to see these topics looping back in and being relevant, which is interesting. The particular mystery in this one involves looking at stuff like the Temple of Mithras, Boudicca's Rebellion, these sorts of moments of history and the remains that exist in contemporary London. Those are topics which I'm really interested in. There's a whole topic of like Arthur running throughout this, like Arthuriana, like Excalibur, Merlin, blah blah, that whole thing, which is another topic which I really enjoy reading about, so this was going really well for me. Even just like passing references in this, like there's a passing reference to like Inigo Jones, the architect. There's a passing reference to Alan Garner's The Weirdstone and Brisingamen series in this, and I was just like, every single one of these references is something which I know and which I like. So I found that particularly enjoying and delightful. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I've given some of these 5 stars in the past. I think with this one, I do still thoroughly enjoy this series. I really enjoyed all of this mystery where it went. Sometimes I feel like we are eking out the main plotline a little bit. It's all very high stakes, but sometimes I'm like, are we going to get a conclusion to this, or are we just going to keep extending it out? And I'm sure he has a conclusion planned, and at the same time, I'd probably be sad if we stopped reading this book. So like, it's a balance to be had, but I did think it was really good, solidly enjoyable entry into this series, which I continue to enjoy. After that, I did some middle grade fiction. I read Malamander by Thomas Taylor. This is a really sweet middle grade mystery book. I have been really enjoying reading some middle grade recently, particularly middle grade mystery books. This takes place in Erie-on-Sea, and the world building of this little seaside town was so delightful. Everything is very seaside themed, so our main character, Herbie Lemon, works in the Grand Nautilus Hotel, which is run by Lady Kraken. There's like a horrible guy who works there, whose name is Mr. Mollusk. Everyone's got, like sea-themed names, and this is exploring this myth that has been told in the town for years and years and years about the Malamander, who is this sea creature that some people believe is real, some people believe is just a story. What happens to Herbie is he gets drawn into this mystery because this girl just appears he runs the Lost and Foundry in the hotel, so if you lose something, he goes to the Lost and Foundry, and Herbie tries to find the rightful owners. So this girl comes to him with a mystery about her missing parents, and she appeals to him as the Lost and Founder. Will he help her unravel the mystery and return her to her parents? This was really delightful. It does that thing where I think it's a really great for the target age range, because again, these mysteries, you're given some clues about some things and you can piece together some bits, but there are enough reveals that are exciting, and there are tense chase sequences in this, and the Malamander is a scary being and stuff. So I just thought that this was full of some really lovely ideas, some really fantastic world building. The style was really enjoyable. I just thoroughly enjoyed every moment of reading this. It's the first book of a series, which I believe is called the Eerie Tales from Erie-on-Sea or something, and I'm wondering if each different book is going to explore different folk tales or different mysteries to do with the town. I don't know, but suffice to say, I think that this was a really, really fun book. I would really recommend it to anyone with sort of middle grade age children who might want something fun to read, so I really liked that. Moving on to some poetry, I also read 600 Years of Bristol Poetry. I don't know who this is collated by. Let me have a look. This is edited by Edward Martin and Bill Pickard. I couldn't find a trace of this on Goodreads. We picked it up from a local bookstore because I live in Bristol. This is 600 years worth of poetry collated. Some of it is by Bristol poets, some of it is by people visiting Bristol, but it is all poetry and writings that are to do with Bristol. It was very interesting to see such a range of views on my home city. Some people writing this are writing poems about how beautiful parts of Bristol are. Some people writing this are writing stuff about how soul-destroying Bristol is. And it was very interesting to see, even people who are writing these from hundreds of years ago, what aspects they're talking about that I can connect to. So there was one particular poem called Bristol Bells by M.C. Tyndall, and I loved reading that one because they're describing a lot of the nature of Bristol, and it made me realise what particular plants and stuff like this are Bristol plants. They were describing them in the poem, and I was like, these descriptions, this is the countryside I grew up in, and that was really fun. I also really enjoyed reading Iris Murdoch's poetry. There's some poetry from when she was 18 and living in Bristol in here. I really enjoyed those. I've never read any of her poetry before. I've only read The Sea by her. So yeah, this was an interesting, fun little dabble into Bristol writings and Bristol poetry. So moving on to my non-fiction, I read 3 non-fiction books. I'm going to talk about, I'm going to go small to large, maybe. I don't know. We're just going to talk about them in a random order. So, my boyfriend lent me Being a Quaker, A Guide for Newcomers by Geoffrey Durham. My boyfriend's a Quaker. I've mentioned it a couple of times. He lent me this because, he lent me this ages ago, I'm going to confess. I've had a little tower of books that he's lent me, and this has been in that tower for quite a while. It was officially the final book in the tower. I have now returned all of the books to him. Hooray! So actually, by the time I'm coming around to reading this, I have a lot more knowledge of Quakers because I've gone to a Quaker meeting with him. He's just a bit further along his journey of being a Quaker. I have a better understanding. I'm not a Quaker. I'm not religious. However, you know, like, my partner is, therefore I would like to learn more about it so I can make sure that, like, I know what he's talking about when he's talking about it and stuff, you know. Basic, like, interest in each other's life, you know. But, suffice to say, I thought I would mention it in this in case anyone watching this is interested in Quakerism or is interested in pursuing Quakerism, that sort of thing. This is a really interesting introduction to it. There was a lot of stuff in this that I now know, but if I'd have actually read it when he originally lent it to me, it would have been much more helpful because I wouldn't have known so much of it. But it's a very interesting introduction into, like, history of Quakerism, the author's personal journey with Quakerism, and Quakerism is a hard one to sort of give, like, great swathing, like, comments on, because a lot of Quakers have different beliefs and approach situations differently and stuff like this. Like, one of the things about Quakerism is that like, a lot of it is, there are no hard and fast rules necessarily. Like, that's a oversimplification, there are some. But, like, a lot of it is about, like, individual journeys and, like, processes and stuff like this. Like, the author of this was drawn to Quakerism because he saw a poster that said, finding peace is a process, not a destination. And I felt like that really sums up a lot of it. Like, there's a lot of Quakerism which is about not just being like, I have done X, Y, and Z, therefore I am now the ultimate Quaker. It's more like processes and working to things and not necessarily achieving perfection, but like working to make things better and stuff. So I have a lot of respect for Quakers. I have a lot of respect for Quakerism as a whole. Quakerism is also something that has, like, there are different, like, schools of Quakerism in some ways, just like there are different schools of, like, Christianity, stuff like this. Some Quakerism is rooted in Christianity. A lot of people's Quakerism is not rooted in Christianity. All of these topics and more discussed in this book. So I just thought I'd mention it because if anyone is interested in Quakerism, it is a really great introduction to it. As are reading the Quaker Faith and Practice little booklets, which are also, like, the actual, like, official Quaker stuff. Yes, that was a drabble. After that, we've got Homintern, How Gay Culture Liberated the Modern World by Gregory Woods. Number one, I really love the cover for this, still love the cover for it, I think it's great. This was a really interesting read. The title of this comes from, it's a play on the word Comintern, which was a belief that was held that there was a society of, like, communists that were, like, trying to influence world events. There was also this belief that there was a society of homosexual people who were trying to control world events and had loads of power and stuff like this. This book starts off by acknowledging that that's nonsense. There was not a secret society of homosexual people who were, like, running the world and out to get the straight people and stuff. It was a thing produced by fear. That said, what this book explores is the fact that there were groups of, and I'm using the word queer because there were a lot of these people who didn't use specific terminology to describe how they identify, that sort of thing. But there were groups of queer people who were influential, specifically mostly within, like, the entertainment, the arts and culture circles, but these groups did exist. They were influential of their time. This book starts in, like, with the trial of Oscar Wilde, and it goes forward from there. One thing I really liked about this is it spans quite a lot of time. From that, if you take that as the start point, it goes up to sort of, like, 70s, sort of 80s type times. And also, geographically, it explores, like, an interesting range of places. So, like, because we're starting with the trial of Oscar Wilde, we're talking a bit about London. Obvious places like, for example, Berlin, with, like, Max Hirschfeld and, like, Weimar era Berlin, like, that was famously, there was a lot of, like, openly queer, like, clubs and stuff like that. Paris, again, had a reputation at certain times for, like, a place you could go if you were queer. But it goes beyond that. It explores, looks at Russia, it looks at Algiers, it looks at, like, Mediterranean, it looks like Greece, stuff like this. I really enjoyed this expansive geographical look. Some of the figures and groups in this that were focused on were people who I was already familiar with and who, if you've done reading into queer history, you might also be familiar with. I will say that just because of the limitations of my own reading, there was a lot of this which was interesting and new to me, which was really exciting. One thing that is acknowledged within this is that the very nature of these groups means that a lot of the people we're looking at come from quite rich and privileged backgrounds. Because a lot of these people, because they're living their lives openly queer in times when that is not something that was, like, very okay, you kind of have to be a bit rich and privileged to be able to still, like, you know, support yourself and stuff, because, you know, for, like, a lot of working class queer people, they just had to sort of, like, stay in the closet and not be discovered, because otherwise they'd lose their ability to work and stuff like that. Like, that is the nature of the groups that are explored in this, but it's something that's acknowledged, and, like, that's just something to acknowledge. But yeah, this was so interesting looking at, it raises a very good point, where this idea of a Homintern and blah blah blah, like, especially within the theatre world, there are various points in history where people involved in the theatre world have railed against the fact that, oh, all of these queer people run the theatre world and they are only interested in recruiting people who are like them and blah blah. And, like, he raises the point, like, as opposed to all those straight people in the theatre world who were really enthusiastic about recruiting people who were different to them and blah blah blah, like, this idea that because queer people tend to gravitate to each other because, like, especially in the times that this is focused on, that's where you find acceptance and people who, like, don't think you're an abomination. That doesn't mean that there's a conspiracy against heterosexual cisgender people. Like, that's not how this works. So that was interesting. So this was very interesting. One thing I will say is that this is quite a dense book. It's not quite academic, but it is quite information heavy. There is so much research that's gone into this. Some people might find that a bit difficult to read. I was okay with it. I read this quite surprisingly quickly, actually. I was expecting this to take me a lot longer, but that's just because I got really into it, because I read it on the weekends I went to Bristol Pride, and so I was like fully ready. So just a warning on that, if you're not someone who reads a lot of non-fiction, this isn't the most accessible place to start. Also, one thing that I struggled with is there is a lot of summarising people's writing in this. So, and it makes sense because some of the people who were focusing on this are writers, and so he's analysing their works and like looking at their views on queerness and stuff like this. But one thing I struggled with is just I got a little bit fatigued at times of just reading summations of other people's novels, partly because I was like, what if I'd wanted to read this? Now I know what happens. And so that was just like a thing. But on the whole, I gave this 4 out of 5 stars because I did really enjoy it. I did think it was horrendously well researched, and it was very interesting and has introduced me to a bunch of pockets of history that I didn't know anything about that I can like go off and read more on, which is good. I'm going to end on a really big, like just physically big book. The Party Dress, A History of Fashionable Occasions by Alexandra Black. I gave this 2 out of 5 stars. I've had this to read for ages. I got gifted it when I was quite young. I was about like, I asked for it for my birthday. And I was so thrilled because I was like, oh, big chunky book, yay. And I've dipped into it throughout time, but I've never probably like sat down and read it, and now I have. I got a bit annoyed with this, partly to do with the layout. This felt very of its time. This was published, I think, 2007. What I struggled with is, from a formatting point of view, this is a book all about party dress throughout history. Theoretically, yay, I'm here for it. It's split into sections: the masquerade, the formal party, the cocktail party, the garden party, the wedding party. The actual text was interesting. There was a lot of history of things that was really interesting. What annoyed me is the formatting of this. Essentially, like the masquerade party, you'll be reading about, like, the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, the role of masquerade parties in his court. Great. My critique with the text itself is that it was very history, and history is interesting. I love my history. You guys know that. However, there wasn't a lot to do with the fashion. I wanted more, if we're talking about the court of Louis XIV and masquerades, what were masquerade fashion? Like, it talks a bit about it, but also, like what is new about those fashions? Like, you made masquerades popular, which surely that meant that certain silhouettes came in, certain, like, mask style, like, I don't know, like, I just wanted a bit more on the fashion detail in the actual body of the text. And what annoyed me is, I'd be reading about the Sun King, but the gigantic illustration, like this size illustration, is about something completely different, and so then you're reading the main text, you have to keep going away to read these tiny little text boxes that are describing what's happening here, but this is completely different to this, and there was a lot of fashion in the photography side, which was very of its time. There were a lot of peak 2000s looks. I'm going to see if I can find some while I continue to talk, because, like, well, like just this is so peak 2000s, and a lot of, like look at that, that's terrible, quite frankly. Sorry, I just didn't like that. And so I got annoyed because so much of the fashion pictures in this are all like 2000s fashion, but we're having all of this text that's telling you all about historical times. I'd have loved more of those images to tie into what she was actually talking about to illustrate those points, because as it is, I had a very disjointed reading experience where I read like a page of the fashion history, and before I read the page I have to interrupt that narrative to read what she's saying about this mid-2000s masquerade look, rather than just like it being a unified whole. I also didn't feel like I really got many insights. I'm not super big. I don't know the most about fashion, but I know about history and stuff like that. So like there was a lot in this which was not overly new information to me. I wasn't quite sure what our point we were arguing was. It's like, yes, masquerades were a thing. What are we arguing? What are we talking about? The role of the party dress in masquerade fashion? I don't really know. So, I got frustrated with the book, is what I'm saying. But yes. I didn't mean to end on a low when we've had so many highs in this book chat. but that's what we have done, so hey. As per usual, have you read any of these? I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. Otherwise, I hope you're having a really lovely day. I will see you next week for something different.